The air in the Gilded Cage tasted like expensive scotch and cheap desperation. Elena wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, her hands trembling as she balanced the crystal tray. She wasn't a waitress. She was a backup dancer, filling in a shift because she needed the rent money, and her feet were screaming in heels she couldn't afford. It was 3 a.m., the hour when the music slowed down and the predators came out to play. She moved toward the VIP booth, the gravitational center of the room. Dominic the Butcher Volkov sat there like a king on a throne of red velvet. He was laughing at a joke one of his lieutenants made, his hand gesturing wildly with a lit cigar. Elena tried to slide the fresh bottle of Macallan onto the table unnoticed, but Dominic shifted. His elbow clipped the tray. One drop. That's all it took. One amber bead of 30-year-old scotch landed on the toe of his bespoke Italian leather loafer. The laughter died instantly. It was as if someone had sucked the oxygen out of the room. Dominic looked down at his shoe, then up at Elena. His eyes were glassy, swimming with alcohol and a cruel, bored malice. "You clumsy little stray," Dominic whispered, the silence in the booth amplifying his voice. "Do you know what this leather is? It's calfskin. It costs more than your entire life." I'm sorry, Mr. Volkov," Elena stammered, grabbing a napkin. She reached down, but Dominic kicked her hand away. "Don't touch me," he snarled. He stood up, towering over her. He was massive, built like a tank, with the scarred knuckles of a man who enjoyed his work. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of hundreds. He slapped the money onto the table. "I'm bored, sweetheart. Let's play a game. The boys tell me I've got a mean left hook. I want to test it." His bodyguards, Titan and Rook, chuckled darkly. They knew the stories. Dominic had cracked a man's skull in an underground ring in Moscow with a single punch. "Here's the deal," Dominic said, rolling up the sleeve of his pinstripe suit, revealing a forearm thick with muscle. "I'm going to take a swing at that pretty little face of yours. If you flinch, you're fired. If you stand there and take it like a good girl, the money is yours." Elena stared at the cash. She was shaking visibly now, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Please, sir, I just want to work." Something passed across her eyes then. Not panic, something older, quieter, like a pilot going through a checklist before a crash landing. It had gone in a blink. No one in the room caught it. "But," Dominic interrupted, a shark-like grin spreading across his face, if you stop me, I'll give you the deed to this club right now." Titan burst out laughing. "Be careful, boss. She looks dangerous." Dominic laughed with him, stepping back to wind up. The cruelty was palpable. He wasn't going to pull the punch. He was going to break her jaw. Elena stood frozen, her eyes wide, her posture slumped in defeat. "1," Dominic counted. He planted his feet. "2." He rotated his hips, the kinetic chain of a trained fighter engaging. "3." Dominic's fist flew forward, a blur of violence aimed directly at her temple. It was a kill shot. Thwack. The sound wasn't the crunch of bone. It was the dull, heavy impact of meat hitting a wall. The room froze. Titan's smile evaporated. Dominic's fist had stopped 6 inches from Elena's face. It hadn't stopped on its own. Elena's hand, small, pale, and delicate, was wrapped around his fist. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't stumbled back. She had absorbed the entire force of a heavyweight haymaker without moving her feet a single millimeter. Dominic blinked, confusion warring with the alcohol in his brain. He tried to pull his hand back. He couldn't. Her fingers were dug into his pressure points like steel clamps. It felt like his hand was caught in a hydraulic press. "Let go," Dominic grunted, panic rising in his chest. Behind him, Titan stood up slowly, his eyes locked on Elena's grip. He saw the thumb placement. He saw the way her wrist was locked. "That's not self-defense," Titan whispered, the color draining from his face. "That's Systema. That's a Spetsnaz deathlock." Elena slowly lifted her head. The trembling was gone. The exhaustion was gone. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a flat, dead calm. The eyes of something that lived in the deep ocean and ate things much bigger than itself. She squeezed. Dominic dropped to his knees with a cry of agony, the bones in his hand grinding together. Elena leaned in, her voice a terrifying whisper that cut through the club's base. "You have poor form, Dominic. You telegraph your left." "Gun!" Titan screamed, his hand flying to his holster as he realized the waitress was about to snap his boss's arm like a dry twig. "Gun!" Titan's scream tore through the bass-heavy air of the club. But the warning came 2 seconds too late. Before Titan or Rook could level their weapons, the geometry of the room shifted. Elena didn't scramble for cover. She didn't run. She simply pivoted on the ball of her foot, yanking Dominic's tortured wrist with a torque that defied her size. With a sickening pop of cartilage, she spun the 240-pound crime lord around, slamming his back against her chest. Dominic Volkov, the butcher of Brighton Beach, was now a human shield. Titan froze, his finger hovering over the trigger of his Glock. He couldn't take the shot. All he could see was his boss's terrified face and a sliver of Elena's gray sweatpants behind him. Gray sweatpants. The most feared man in 3 boroughs was being held hostage by someone dressed for a Sunday laundry run. She's not just fast, Titan realized, a cold sweat breaking on his neck. She moved before I even shouted. She felt the tension in the air. She read the micro tremors in Dominic's muscles. This wasn't a bar fight. This was military-grade kinetic chess, and they were the pawns. "Back off," Elena commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute authority of an executioner reading a name off a list. She shoved Dominic forward. It wasn't a gentle push. It was a calculated kinetic discharge. Dominic stumbled, crashing into Rook and sending them both sprawling onto the crushed velvet sofa. 280 combined pounds of organized crime, folded like laundry. The room went deadly silent. The music had cut out. The only sound was Dominic's ragged breathing as he cradled his purple, swelling hand. Elena stood alone in the center of the VIP section. She didn't flee. She adjusted the strap of her tank top, took a slow breath, and for a terrifying second, the shark eyes vanished. She looked like a tired, overworked girl again. Just like that, like a switch. The most unsettling part wasn't what she'd done. It was how easily she'd stopped doing it. Dominic scrambled to his feet, his face cycling rapidly through pain, disbelief, and the very specific shade of purple reserved for men whose egos have been publicly shattered. He looked at the girl who had just folded him in front of his entire crew. "Who sent you?" he spat, blood flecking his lips. "The triads? The cartel? Who sends a dancer to break my arm?" Elena looked down at her worn-out sneakers, then back up. "I just wanted my tips, Mr. Volkov. I needed to pay rent." A flash of cold steel returned to her gaze. Quiet, unhurried, inevitable. "But I have a rule. I don't like being hit." Dominic's last functioning nerve snapped. His ego was bruised far worse than his wrist, and in his world, embarrassment had only one cure. He reached into his waistband with his good hand. The gold-plated Desert Eagle came out fast. He didn't care about the club anymore. He didn't care about the deed. He was going to put a bullet in her just to stop the shaking in his own hands. "You're dead, you little—" Zip! A tiny red dot appeared on Dominic's forehead, right between his eyes. Perfectly centered, almost respectful. He froze. Zip, zip, zip. Another dot on his throat, one on his heart, one on the hand still holding the gun. Within a single breath, Dominic Volkov was painted in a full constellation of laser sights. He looked like a heavily armed Christmas tree. Titan and Rook glanced down to find matching decorations dancing across their own chests. The club wasn't just surrounded, it was owned. Dominic's eyes crawled slowly across the skylights, the mezzanine, the shadowed corners of the balcony. The snipers were everywhere, patient, invisible, and clearly very good at their jobs. He lowered the Desert Eagle. Elena looked at the lasers quilting the room, then back at Dominic. She exhaled, not with relief, not with triumph, but with the specific weary irritation of someone whose staff has, once again, ignored a very simple instruction. "I told them to wait outside," she muttered. "They never listen." "I told them to wait outside," Elena muttered, but her eyes weren't looking at the lasers dancing on Dominic's chest. She was looking at her wrist. A thin black fitness tracker hidden beneath her sweatband was pulsing a frantic red light. Biometric spike confirmed. Location broadcasting. Dominic squinted at her, confusion warring with the terror of having a dozen sniper rifles aimed at his heart. "Your friends?" "No," Elena said, her voice dropping to a flat professional timbre. "The Vipers, rogue mercenaries." She paused just long enough. "They don't take prisoners. Also, they tracked me here because my heart rate spiked." She glanced at Dominic. "Your fault, by the way." Crash. The skylight exploded. A rain of tempered glass and flashbang grenades poured into the VIP lounge. The universe's way of confirming this was no longer a hospitality issue. "Get down!" Elena screamed. She didn't wait for Dominic to react. She kicked the heavy marble table over, flipping it onto its side just as the first wave of suppressed gunfire chewed through the velvet sofa where they had been standing a breath ago. My Dominic was frozen. He was a street fighter, a brute who dealt in intimidation and broken kneecaps. He was not a soldier. The coordinated breach, men in black tactical gear rappelling from the ceiling with MP5s, had locked his brain in a full, undignified panic loop. The butcher of Brighton Beach was standing in the middle of a war zone with his mouth open, which was not the look. Elena moved for him. She grabbed him by his silk tie, his very expensive, very stupid silk tie, and yanked him down behind the overturned table. "Move, you idiot!" she hissed, dragging him across the floor as bullets sparked against the marble. She hauled him behind the solid oak bar, shoving him down amidst the broken glass and spilled liquor. Dominic was hyperventilating, clutching his chest. "Why?" Dominic yelled over the deafening roar of automatic fire. "Why are you saving me? You could have run." Elena grabbed a discarded Glock 17 from the floor. Titan's gun. She checked the magazine, racked the slide, and thumbed the safety off in one fluid motion that took less time than it takes to blink. "Because you owe me the club," Elena replied, not looking at him. She peeked over the bar, reading the room through a shard of shattered mirror. "And dead men don't sign deeds." 3 mercenaries were advancing in a tight phalanx. Their armor was heavy. Center mass shots would be like throwing grapes at a refrigerator. Elena reached up and pulled a pristine bottle of Belvedere vodka from the shelf. Top shelf. The good stuff. She looked at it for one brief, mournful second. "Count to 3, she whispered to Dominic. "What?" "1. Elena hurled the vodka bottle high into the air, to over the bar top, $40 a pour, spinning end over end into the dark. The mercenaries' instincts kicked in. Trained reflexes, expensive gear, and they all looked up at a flying bottle of vodka like golden retrievers watching a tennis ball. "Professionals." 2. Elena popped up. She didn't aim at the men. She aimed at the brass footrail running along the bottom of the bar. Bang. One single round. It struck the curved brass at a perfect 45-degree angle, ricocheted upward, and tore through the unarmored throat of the point man. He dropped, his finger clenching the trigger on the way down, his own weapon spraying wildfire directly into his 2 partners. The remaining mercenaries scrambled, slipping in a spreading cocktail of premium vodka and considerably less premium outcomes. 3, Elena finished calmly, as if she just completed a Sudoku. She grabbed Dominic's collar. Kitchen, now! They stayed low, sprinting through the shattered remains of the lounge. Dominic was stumbling, his $5,000 shoes finding every puddle and every piece of broken glass with unerring accuracy. Elena moved like a phantom beside him, fluid, silent, and deeply unbothered by the war zone around her. They hit the kitchen doors. Elena slammed her shoulder into them, expecting the swing. Clang. Nothing. Solid as a vault. She stepped back and kicked the latch. She looked at the seams. Fresh gray scorch marks lined the door frame. Still warm. Thermite, she whispered, touching the hot metal with 2 fingers. They welded it shut from the outside. From across the club, a plasma cutter hissed to life. Sparks began cascading from the front entrance like a very aggressive fireworks display. The Vipers were removing the last exit from the equation. Dominic stared at the sealed kitchen door, then at the front entrance eating itself alive with sparks, then at Elena. The full geometry of their situation settled on him like a collapsed ceiling. We're trapped, he whispered. We're rats in a barrel. Elena said nothing. She just stared at the welded door, jaw tight, running the math on options that weren't there yet. We're not rats, Titan wheezed from the corner. He was slumped against a commercial refrigerator, clutching a dark stain spreading across his dress shirt. Rats run, we fight. Dominic looked at his head of security. The man was built like a geological feature and currently losing a debate with gravity. Then at Elena. She was pacing the stainless steel gauntlet of the kitchen, her eyes darting from the industrial stoves to the ceiling vents, with the focused, unhurried energy of someone doing very fast math on everyone else's behalf. Her hair had come loose from its bun, falling in messy strands around her face. Titan squinted through his blurring vision. He saw it then, a small, distinct mark behind her right ear. Not ink, a brand, a barcode, precise and institutional, the kind that doesn't come from a tattoo parlor. Project Chimera, Titan whispered. The words came out wet. Dominic froze. What? The rumors, Titan gasped. His eyes locked on Elena with an expression caught somewhere between terror and the specific reverence of a man who has just realized he picked a fight with a landmark. Sleeper agents, biologically enhanced. She's not a girl. Dominic. He exhaled slowly. She's a multi-million-dollar government weapon. Elena stopped pacing. She didn't deny it. She didn't even look at them. She was looking at the 50-pound sack of flour on the prep table and the bubbling vat of the deep fryer beside it, with the quiet, professional interest of a chef planning a very unusual tasting menu. Cover your ears, Elena said, and hold your breath. Why? Dominic asked. The service doors at the far end of the kitchen answered for her. Crump. They blew inward. A flashbang grenade skittered across the tile like an enthusiastic, extremely dangerous hockey puck. 6 mercenaries in heavy tactical gear stormed through the smoke, laser sights cutting white lines through the haze. Elena moved. She grabbed the flour sack, ripped it open with a knife, and hurled the contents into the air. A massive white cloud billowed out and hung there, fat and patient and full of potential. Fire in the hole, she said, quietly, almost politely. She kicked the stand of the deep fryer. The vat tipped. Gallons of boiling oil cascaded into the open pilot light of the gas range. Ki boom. The flour dust ignited. It wasn't an explosion so much as a thermobaric argument. A shock wave that blew the kitchen windows clean out and threw the lead mercenaries off their feet like action figures. Expensive action figures, but still. Hiss. The heat triggered the emergency suppression system. Halon gas erupted from the ceiling nozzles in thick white chemical fog, engineered to strip oxygen from the room and kill the fire dead. It also, as a complimentary service, blinded everyone in it. Stay down, Dominic yelled, burying his face in his arms. Elena did not stay down. In the white fog, she became something without a name. Dominic couldn't see her. Nobody could, but he could hear the work. The wet crunch of a larynx being introduced to a forearm, the mechanical snap of a tactical vest being used as leverage against the spine it was supposed to protect. The mercenaries fired blindly, their bullets sparking and ringing off pots and hanging pans, but they were shooting at a ghost who kept moving, and ghosts have excellent cardio. One by one, the screams stopped being screams. Snap, thud, snap, thud, snap, thud. It took 30 seconds, the same amount of time it takes to make a decent cup of tea, considerably less relaxing. Then silence, just the hiss of empty halon tanks and the patient dripping of oil. The white fog thinned, pulled apart by the ventilation fans above. Dominic slowly raised his head. 6 highly trained killers lay broken across the tile in angles that joints are not designed to make. Not a single shot had been fired by Elena. The flower was still settling like snow over a battlefield it had no business being in. Elena stood in the center of it all, wiping a speck of white from her cheek. She wasn't breathing hard. She looked with profound injustice, like she had just finished a light warm-up stretch and found it slightly beneath her. She stepped over a body, carefully, almost considerately, and extended her hand to Dominic. "We have 90 seconds before the second wave breaches the perimeter," she said, glancing at her watch with the same energy as someone checking whether the post office is still open. "My car is out back in the alley." She looked at him. "Drive or die, Dominic." "To choose." The alley behind the Gilded Cage smelled of garbage and ozone. Elena sprinted toward a rusted, dented 2005 Honda Civic, wedged between 2 dumpsters, like it was embarrassed to be seen. "You have got to be kidding me," Dominic panted, clutching his bruised ribs. He looked at the car the way a man looks at something that has personally offended his ancestry. "I don't ride in Civics. I have an armored Maybach." "Your Maybach is a GPS-tracked coffin," Elena snapped, unlocking the driver's side. "Get in." Dominic hesitated, looking back at the smoking ruin of his club. His legacy, currently venting black smoke into the night sky like a crematorium with ambition. The wail of approaching sirens made the decision for him. He dove into the passenger seat and immediately regretted the state of the upholstery. Elena keyed the ignition. The car didn't sputter, it roared. Not the apologetic whine of a 4-cylinder engine that has given up on itself. A deep chest cavity growl, the sound of a twin-turbo V8 that had been surgically installed into a body it had absolutely no business being in. Like finding a nuclear reactor inside a microwave. She slammed the gear shift. The Honda peeled out of the alley with enough G-force to pin Dominic against the stained upholstery, which he was now intimately acquainted with, whether he liked it or not. They wove through traffic at 90 miles an hour. Dominic yanked his gold-plated iPhone from his pocket. "I'm calling the crew. We'll meet at the docks. I'll have 50 men here in 10 minutes. He stared at the screen. No signal. He tapped it furiously. "My accounts. My contacts. Yeah, the screen is black. What the hell?" "Localized cyber kill," Elena said, eyes locked on the rearview mirror. "They didn't just jam your signal, Dominic. They wiped your digital footprint." She took a hard right, drifting through a red light without ceremony. "As of 5 minutes ago, Dominic Volkov doesn't exist." Dominic lowered the phone slowly. A man who had spent 30 years making sure everyone knew his name, gone from the record in 5 minutes. "Who is they? The feds? The cartel?" "Chimera," Elena said. "I'm not a waitress. I'm Subject 7, a government program, chemically enhanced adrenaline responses, accelerated combat conditioning, the full catalog. I escaped 3 years ago." Dominic stared at her profile as the street lights strobed across her face. Titan was right. "You're a weapon." "I was a science experiment," she corrected, with the quiet practiced firmness of someone who has had to make that distinction before. "I've been hiding in plain sight, Dancing kept my heart rate low, below 110 beats per minute. That keeps the serum dormant, keeps the tracker dark. She glanced at him. Rhythmic movement, predictable tempo, nothing that would spike the system. A beat. And then you decided to swing at me. Dominic had the specific expression of a man watching a very expensive domino topple in slow motion. My survival instinct kicked in. Heart rate spiked to 160. Beacon went live. She said it without drama, which somehow made it worse. They didn't come for you, Dominic. They came for me. Your collateral damage. The cold knot in Dominic's stomach tightened into something approaching a black hole. I brought a hit squad down on my own club, he said slowly, on my own crew. The full weight of it settled on him like a building. Because I tried to slap a waitress. A dancer, technically, Elena said. But yes, congratulations. You are the most expensive idiot in the city. Then drop me off, Dominic exploded. If they want you, let them have you. I'll take my chances. Too late, Elena said, nodding at the side mirror. Her voice hadn't changed pitch even slightly, which was somehow more frightening than if she'd screamed. You've seen my face. You know the program exists. To Chimera, you stopped being a crime lord about 45 minutes ago. She paused. Now you're just a loose end. Dominic opened his mouth. A high beams detonated across the cabin, blinding, white, and coming from exactly the wrong direction. Hold on, Elena screamed. An armored black SUV, running dark with no headlights, shot from the side street like a fired round. It caught the passenger side of the Honda with the force of a freight train that had decided to make this personal. The world inverted. Metal shrieked against asphalt. The Honda rolled, once, twice, glass detonating outward in a glittering cloud, the car skidding sideways across the pavement and obliterating the chain-link gate of a subway entrance like it wasn't there. The car tilted over the edge, groaned, and then dropped, nose first in total silence, down the concrete stairs and into the darkness below. The Honda had become a crumpled accordion of metal and steam, wedged against the turnstile with the dignity of a man who has tripped in public and is pretending it didn't happen. Dominic kicked his door open, coughing as airbag dust filled his lungs. He crawled out onto the dirty subway tiles, Brioni suit shredded, $5,000 shoes scuffed beyond any conversation about resale value. Move, Elena commanded. She was already out, pulling him up by his collar. She didn't look like a dancer anymore. Blood trickled from a cut at her hairline, mixing with the grease on her face, and she had the focused expression of someone who had crossed bad evening off the list and moved on to operational emergency. They're coming down the stairs, she hissed, pointing toward the twisted wreckage of the entrance. Heavy boots crunched on the glass above. They sprinted past the empty toll booth, jumped the tracks, and plunged into the suffocating darkness of the tunnels. Dominic immediately stepped into ankle-deep sludge. The sound it made was deeply personal. I can't see a thing, he growled, palming the walls like a man reading the world's most unpleasant braille. Where are we going? Keep quiet, Elena whispered. She didn't stumble. She moved through the pitch-black tunnel with an eerie, feline confidence. No hesitation, no patting of walls, no sludge. She grabbed his hand with an iron grip and steered him around a drop-off he hadn't seen and would absolutely have found the hard way. My city stops at street level, Dominic muttered, trying to match her pace and mostly failing. Down here, I'm nobody. Down here, Elena said, pulling him into a maintenance alcove. Money doesn't talk. Well, only echoes do. She leaned against the damp brick wall and winced, reaching for her shoulder. The strap of her tank top had torn in the crash, and in the thin moonlight falling through a grate above, Dominic saw her upper back properly for the first time. He went very still. It wasn't bruising from the crash. Her back was a road map of something much older and much worse. white scars crossing her shoulder blades in surgical lines, burn marks, lashings, the kind of record that institutions leave on people they consider property rather than human beings. He pulled the silk handkerchief from his pocket, $1,200 of Italian fabric, now the most useful thing he owned, and pressed it against the fresh cut. His hand brushed the old scars. A wave of nausea moved through him, and it had nothing to do with the blood. "Ah, I tried to hit you," Dominic said quietly, staring at what the program had made of her. "I treated you like nothing. I thought you were weak." Elena didn't pull away. She looked at him steadily in the dark. "I am weak, Dominic. I'm small. I have hollow bones." A corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. "I bruise like a peach." She tightened the makeshift bandage with one hand. "That's why I learned to be fast. Strength is a crutch for men who think they're invincible." She looked back up at him. "Speed is for those of us who know we can die." Dominic, for once in his adult life, had absolutely nothing to say to that. Then Elena's hand shot up and covered his mouth. A low-frequency vibration moved through the tunnel like a second heartbeat. Then a distinct green light swept across the mildewed ceiling 50 yards back. Slow, patient, methodical. "Cleaners," Elena breathed against his ear. Her voice was barely air. "Thermal goggles. They can see our body heat through the walls." Dominic processed this information. "Run," he said. They ran. They splashed through the drainage water, the green light sweeping faster behind them, gaining geometry with every turn. The cleaners made no sound, no shouts, no radio chatter, no footsteps heavier than necessary. The silence was somehow more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Gunfire was honest. This was something else entirely. They rounded a corner and stopped. "Damn it!" Dominic's voice bounced off every wall in the tunnel, which helped no one. A massive iron storm grate filled the passage from floor to ceiling, bolted into the bedrock, furred with decades of rust and absolute indifference to their situation. No handle, no keypad, no moral flexibility whatsoever. Just iron. Behind them, the footsteps ceased. 3 figures in sleek black armor materialized from the dark quad-lens night vision goggles, casting 4 pale green glows each. 12 cold lights in total, arranged on 3 faces that had never once in their professional lives been told no. They raised their suppressed submachine guns. 50 feet of kill zone, an immovable wall of iron, and 3 people who did this for a living. Elena reached into the pocket of her gray sweatpants, the gray sweatpants that had started this entire evening, that had witnessed a Spetsnaz deathlock, a flower explosion, a car crash, and an ankle-deep slog through tunnel sludge, and had somehow held up throughout all of it. She produced a spherical object she had quietly borrowed from the mercenary in the kitchen, an M67 fragmentation grenade, which is not standard equipment for a backup dancer. She looked at Dominic. Her eyes were wild and desperate and terrifyingly, disturbingly alive. "Trust me?" she asked. "Do I have a choice?" Dominic replied, in the tone of a man who already knows the answer. Elena didn't throw it at the assassins. She jammed the grenade into the rusted hinge of the storm grate, precisely, deliberately, like she had done this before or had always known she would. Ping. She pulled the pin. Boom. The explosion didn't just blow the grate, it ruptured the ancient brickwork around it entirely. A torrent of pressurized sludge and river water surged through the breach, sweeping Dominic and Elena off their feet like particularly well-dressed ragdolls. They tumbled through the pitch-black cistern, battered against concrete in the dark, until the tunnel spat them out into the freezing currents of the East River, with the ceremony of a drain clearing itself. They dragged themselves onto the muddy bank, gasping. The Manhattan skyline shimmered across the water, luminous, indifferent, and completely unbothered by their evening. 2 hours later, they were 60 floors up. Dominic's safe house was a sterile, glass-walled penthouse registered to a shell company owned by a shell company, which was itself a subsidiary of a holding group that technically existed in the Cayman Islands and morally existed nowhere. It smelled of unused furniture and expensive cold air. Dominic limped into the living room, leaving a trail of river muck across the pristine white carpet, a trail that cost approximately $400 per footstep to clean. He went straight for the bar, poured a whiskey with a hand that hadn't fully decided to stop shaking yet, and downed it in one movement. He turned to Elena. She was standing at the coffee table, shivering slightly, systematically dismantling the Glock with the focused attention of someone who finds this genuinely relaxing. "Go take a shower," Dominic said, his voice carrying the automatic authority of a man who has spent a decade never repeating himself. "There are clothes in the master bedroom. Get cleaned up. We need to plan." Elena did not move. She did not look up. She picked up the recoil spring and wiped it down with a napkin. Click. Snap. She reassembled the slide with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a crossword. "I said—" Dominic stepped forward. "I heard you," Elena said, slamming the magazine home. She looked up at him with an expression that could most accurately be described as unbothered. "I'm not deaf, Dominic, and I'm not your employee." She set the Glock down with a quiet finality that somehow carried more authority than if she'd aimed it. "Stop barking orders at me." Dominic opened his mouth, closed it. For 10 years, rooms had rearranged themselves when he raised his voice. Grown men had apologized for existing in the wrong place. And here was a woman covered in river sludge, reassembling a handgun on his coffee table, really looking at him like he was a minor inconvenience she was choosing, out of generosity, to tolerate. He sat down on the sofa. This was, if he was being honest with himself, the correct move. He grabbed the remote and turned on the wall-mounted television. Breaking news. Red letters, urgent music. The particular theatrical alarm of a network that has found its story for the week. "Tonight, a massacre at the Gilded Cage," the anchor announced, her voice carrying the practiced gravity of someone reading from a teleprompter and believing every word. Footage of body bags being wheeled out of the club filled the screen. Police have identified the prime suspect as club owner Dominic the Butcher Volkov. Sources say he orchestrated the attack to purge rival gang members. A citywide manhunt is now underway. Dominic stared at his own face on the screen. His face, his club, his name, attached to a crime he didn't commit, broadcast on every channel to every person in the city who had spent a decade either fearing him or owing him something. "They framed me," he said quietly. "My reputation, my crew, my leverage." He did the math slowly, the way you do when the numbers are too bad to rush. "Gone. In 4 hours. Whoever sent the Vipers, the architect, he's thorough," Elena said, turning off the TV without ceremony. "He didn't just want you dead, he wanted you erased. There's a difference." Dominic looked at her, the scars on her shoulder, the dried blood at her hairline, the posture of someone who had been erased once already and had decided quietly and without drama not to stay that way. He couldn't survive the night alone. He'd known it since the tunnel. He was just arriving at the part where he admitted it. "Half," Dominic said. "Excuse me?" $1 billion in offshore accounts, jurisdictions the feds have never heard of. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. Not the posture of a king, but of a man making an honest offer. "Help me take back my city. Help me kill the architect. I'll give you $500 million. Cash. You can disappear forever." Elena was quiet for a moment. She looked at the city lights spread out below them. The same city that had just put Dominic's face on every screen and her biometrics on every tracker. Then back at him. "Done," she said. But one condition. Name it. We don't do it your way." She walked toward the bedroom with the unhurried stride of someone who has already decided how this goes. No bravado, no army of men with gold-plated guns. We do it my way. Silent, surgical, ghost protocol. She reached into Dominic's emergency duffel, the one packed for nights exactly like this, though presumably not quite this specific, and threw a bundle of black fabric at his chest. He caught it, unfolded it. A black tactical turtleneck. Matte fabric. No logo. No silk. Nothing that cost more than $40. "You look like a target in that suit," Elena said, disappearing into the bathroom. The shower turned on. "If you want to live," her voice carried over the water, "you dress like me." Dominic looked down at the turtleneck, then at the shredded remains of his Bryony suit, bespoke, hand-stitched, currently held together by river sediment and optimism. He started changing. The mayor's charity gala was a sea of diamonds, black ties, and fake smiles inside the Metropolitan Museum, which is to say it looked exactly like every other charity gala that has ever pretended to solve problems it mostly benefits from. "Shoulders forward, head down," Elena whispered, adjusting Dominic's bow tie in the reflection of a display case, housing a very expensive vase that neither of them were looking at. "You walk like a lion. You take up too much space. If you want to survive tonight, you need to be a mouse." Dominic gritted his teeth, fighting the biological urge to straighten his spine. "I don't do mouse well." "I know," Elena said, her eyes critical, cataloging every flaw in his posture with the efficiency of a quality control inspector. "That's why you almost died in the club. Tonight you're not the boss. You're the invisible man." She paused. "You're the waiter everyone ignores. You're the furniture." She stepped back. Elena had transformed. The gray sweatpants, the legendary, indestructible gray sweatpants, were gone, replaced by a backless emerald gown she had acquired from a dry cleaner's rack an hour ago. The quotation marks around acquired were doing a lot of work. She looked stunning, in the way that certain apex predators are beautiful right before they do something irreversible. But Dominic knew better. The dress was cut high on the thigh to allow for kicks. Her clutch purse held 2 ceramic knives that wouldn't trip a metal detector. She wasn't wearing a gown. Maybe she was wearing camouflage. "The architect is here," Elena said, tapping the pearl earring that doubled as a parabolic microphone receiver. "I'm picking up an encrypted signal from the VIP balcony. We need to get closer." "The floor is too crowded," Dominic noted, scanning the room with the instinct of a man who used to own rooms like this and was now trespassing in one. "Then we blend in," Elena said, grabbing his hand. "Dance with me." The orchestra swelled into a tango, sharp, staccato, violent, the kind of music that sounds like an argument set to strings. Dominic pulled her onto the floor. He knew the steps. His mother had made him learn when he was 12, in a brownstone that no longer existed, in a life that felt like someone else's. But this wasn't a ballroom dance. This was tactical maneuvering disguised as culture. "Target at 10 o'clock, Elena whispered, her body pressed against his, her voice barely audible over the music. Dominic spun her, dipping her low to avoid the line of sight of a security guard who was pretending to admire a sculpture while watching the room. The physical chemistry was immediate and electric. For the first time since the nightclub, they were in perfect sync. Dominic provided the frame, the raw power, the structural authority. But Elena controlled the space, guiding him through the gaps in the crowd with the smallest pressure on his shoulder, a slight shift of weight, a tilt of her head. It was exactly like the tunnel, like the kitchen, like every moment they'd survived together. "I'm isolating the voice," Elena murmured, her eyes closed as they moved. "North balcony. He's talking about the club." Step, pivot, slide. Dominic spun her out in a sharp rotation, then pulled her back in with enough force to make it look passionate rather than tactical, a move that positioned them directly beneath the balcony. "Listen," Elena said, toggling the audio feed to his earpiece. A voice drifted down, familiar, smooth as aged whiskey, carrying the specific warmth of a man who knows exactly how much trust he spent his life earning. "It's done. The Vipers scrubbed the site. The city is ours." Dominic froze mid-step. He knew that voice the way you know your own breathing. He had trusted that voice with his life for 10 years, with his money, with his secrets, with the kind of loyalty you can't fake and can't replace. He looked up. Standing on the balcony, silhouetted against the chandelier light, holding a champagne flute like he owned the building, which, financially speaking, he probably did now, was Marcus, his consigliere, his advisor, his brother in every way that didn't involve shared blood. "Marcus!" Dominic breathed. The betrayal landed harder than any punch Elena had blocked. It was him. He's the architect. As if summoned by the thought, Marcus looked down. Their eyes locked across the distance. Marcus didn't panic. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon or signal security or do any of the things guilty men do when caught. He simply smiled. A sad, almost affectionate smile, the kind you give someone when you're proud of them for finally figuring it out, but also sorry it took them this long. He raised his glass to the chandelier and tapped it with a silver spoon. The crystal ring cut through the music like a bell at a funeral. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced. His voice carried effortlessly, amplified by the museum's Baroque acoustics and by the sudden, absolute silence of everyone in the room. The orchestra stopped mid-phrase. "A toast," he smiled wider, "to the late Dominic Volkov." Click. The sound of heavy magnetic locks sealing the museum's main doors echoed through the marble hall like the bolt of a very large, very expensive coffin. And to his final performance, Marcus tipped his glass back, drank. Around them, the guests stopped pretending. 50 men and women in evening wear, tuxedos, gowns, pearls that cost more than cars, reached into their jackets and clutches. They didn't pull out phones or lipstick or the polite fictions of high society. They pulled out suppressed pistols. Elena and Dominic stood back to back in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by a perfect circle of weapons aimed directly at them with the patience of professionals who get paid either way. "It's a trap," Elena whispered. Dominic, to his credit, did not say "I know." "Kill them," Marcus said, sipping his champagne like a man checking the weather. 50 suppressed pistols coughed at once. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The sound of very expensive problems arriving all at once. "Down!" Elena screamed. She didn't dive. She dropped. In one fluid motion, she ripped the emerald silk of her gown straight up to her hip, a sound like expensive fabric giving up on formal events forever. Freeing her legs. Beside her, Dominic roared, grabbing the edge of a massive oak banquet table. With a surge of hysterical strength fueled entirely by spite and survival instinct, he flipped the 400-pound table onto its side, creating a barricade just as the wood began to splinter under a hail of 9mm rounds. "We can't stay here," Dominic yelled, the table disintegrating in real time around them. Chunks of oak the size of fists were peeling off like bark. "We're fish in a barrel." "Then we become sharks," Elena said. She pulled 2 ceramic knives from her clutch, which had, somehow, survived the evening better than either of them. "On my mark, break left." "Mark!" They exploded from cover. The room dissolved into a chaotic 360-degree brawl. A perfect storm of violence set to the faint background music of a Vivaldi piece the orchestra had abandoned 30 seconds ago when the shooting started. Dominic fought like a sledgehammer with a grudge. He grabbed a mercenary by the throat and hurled him bodily into a display case of Ming vases, which responded to the introduction by shattering into approximately 6 figures of insurance liability. He was brute force, a moving disaster, a tank in a tuxedo. Elena was the scalpel. She moved in the spaces between bullets, not dodging them so much as never being where they arrived in the first place. A mercenary swung his submachine gun toward Dominic's exposed back. Elena saw it. She snatched a heavy silver serving tray from a passing waiter's cart. The waiter himself had made several excellent life choices in the last 45 seconds and was no longer in the building. And with a pivot of her hips, flung it like a discus. Clang! The edge of the tray caught the gunman square in the throat. He dropped instantly, which solved that problem and also ruined the tray's resale value. In the same breath, a second attacker lunged at her with a knife that looked entirely too expensive to be standard mercenary issue. Elena didn't retreat. She dropped to her knees and slid at me straight across the polished marble floor, directly between Dominic's legs as he threw a haymaker at another guard. She emerged on the other side like a baseball player stealing home, sweeping the legs of a third attacker who fell at exactly the right angle to meet Dominic's rising uppercut. They hadn't rehearsed this. They were just that good at ruining people's evenings. "Balcony!" Elena shouted, dodging a knife thrust aimed at somewhere important. "Go!" They carved a path of broken bones and shattered glass. The museum's insurance adjuster was going to need therapy, and burst through the French doors onto the stone terrace. Dominic slammed them shut, locked them, realized immediately that locks were cosmetic. He looked over the edge of the balcony. "It's a 10-story drop, Elena. There's no fire escape." His voice had the specific pitch of a man who has just done the math and does not like the answer. The glass of the French doors began to spiderweb under sustained gunfire. They had seconds. Maybe. Elena looked up. A massive, heavy velvet curtain was billowing from an open window 1 floor above them, tied off with a thick gold cord that probably cost more than the average car. "Hold on tight," Elena said, grabbing Dominic's lapels. To what?" Elena drew her knife and slashed the curtain's tie-back cord in one clean motion. "To me!" She grabbed the velvet fabric, wrapped it around her wrist like she'd done this before, or like she'd always known she'd have to do it eventually, and jumped. Dominic grabbed her waist just as gravity remembered they existed. They swung out into the void, a pendulum of desperate survival and poor decision-making, arcing over the alleyway below like the world's least planned escape route. Behind them, a mercenary, professional to the end, tossed a grenade onto the balcony to finish the job. Boom! The explosion blew the French doors outward in a spray of glass and fire. The shock wave caught them mid-swing, which should have been catastrophic, but instead propelled them further than physics had any right allowing, hurling them across the alley gap toward the neighboring brownstone like they'd been fired from a cannon made of poor life choices. They crashed onto the gravel roof in a tangle of limbs, bruised ribs, and what used to be formal wear. Dominic groaned, rolling onto his back. He stared up at the column of black smoke billowing from the museum, backlit by the city lights. He started to laugh. A manic, adrenaline-fueled sound that came from a part of the brain that handles relief and hysteria in equal measure. "We made it," he wheezed, the words barely making it past his lungs. "We actually made it." He sat up, wiping soot and what might have been someone else's blood from his face. "Elena, you're insane. That was—" He stopped. Elena was lying on her side a few feet away, perfectly still. She hadn't moved since they landed. "Adi, Elena?" Dominic crawled over to her, gravel biting into his palms. "Come on, we have to keep moving." He touched her shoulder to roll her over. His hand came away wet. Not sweat, not water, blood. Elena looked up at him. Her face was pale. Not the controlled calm she'd worn all night, but the specific pallor of a system losing the fight. Her lips were blue. She tried to speak. A bubble of blood escaped instead of words. She moved her hands slowly from her abdomen. The emerald dress was black now, soaked through. A single bullet hole, center mass, just below the ribs. Dominic's breath stopped. She'd been shot, and she hadn't said a word. The neon sign of the Paws and Claws 24-hour veterinary clinic flickered in the rain like it was having second thoughts about being open. Dominic didn't ring the bell. He kicked the glass door in, safety glass shattering across the linoleum in a glittering spray that was going to be someone's problem in the morning. He was carrying Elena. Her blood was soaking through his shirt, warm and terrifyingly fast, and he was running out of shirt. "Help her!" Dominic roared. His voice cracked on the second word. A terrified veterinarian, Dr. Eris, according to the name tag pinned to a lab coat that had seen better decades, stumbled out of the back room, dropping a clipboard. He saw the gun in Dominic's waistband, then the girl in his arms, then did the math on how his evening had just changed. I treat dogs," the vet stammered, backing into a display of flea collars. "I can't operate on a human. It's illegal. I don't have the anesthesia. I don't have the license." Dominic slammed Elena onto the steel examination table with more care than the sound suggested. He grabbed the vet by the collar, shoving the barrel of his gun under the man's chin. His hand was shaking. "She is a stray," Dominic hissed, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "And if she dies, you die. Fix her." Dr. Eris looked at the girl on the table, then at the gun, then made the kind of decision you can't unmake. "Get me the suture kit," he said quietly, "and the ketamine." 2 hours later, Elena was stable, sedated. The bullet had missed the artery by what Dr. Eris had described, in a shaking voice as, "Maybe 3 millimeters, maybe divine intervention, I don't know, I'm a veterinarian." It had nicked the liver. She'd lost a lot of blood. She was pale, looking smaller than ever under the harsh fluorescent lights. The kind of lights that make everyone look like they're auditioning for a morgue. Dominic stood over her. He brushed a stray hair from her forehead with a hand that hadn't stopped shaking since the roof. For the first time in his adult life, Dominic Volkov wasn't thinking about money or territory or reputation or any of the things that had filled the space where other people kept their feelings. He was thinking about debt, the kind you can't pay in cash. She had taken a bullet meant for him. He grabbed a prescription pad from the counter. 4 anxious Labradors, dosage as needed, and scribbled a note on the back. He placed it next to her hand, careful not to disturb the IV line. "You saved my life. Now I save yours." He walked out into the rain without looking back. He didn't take the car. He walked, slowly, deliberately, like a man who has already arrived at the only decision that matters. He opened his jacket. Strapped to his chest were 6 blocks of C4 he had carefully stripped from the mercenaries' tactical gear back at the museum. Back when Elena was still conscious and the night still had outcomes that weren't this. He wasn't going to win this war. He was going to end it. The Viper's headquarters was a converted slaughterhouse in the meatpacking district, because of course it was. Villains don't set up shop in co-working spaces. Marcus sat in the center of the kill floor like a king on a throne made of poor life choices, surrounded by 20 of his best men, all armed, all loyal, all about to have a very bad night. The heavy iron doors creaked open. Dominic walked in, alone, hands up, showing he was unarmed, which was technically true if you didn't count the 6 pounds of military-grade explosives under his jacket. Marcus laughed, the sound bouncing off the meat hook still hanging from the ceiling, which was atmospheric but also deeply unnecessary. "Dominic, I expected you to run. Maybe beg, maybe cry into a bottle of something expensive." He leaned forward. "But surrender? That's new." "I'm not here to surrender, Marcus," Dominic said. His voice was flat, dead calm, the tone of a man who has run out of things to lose. He stopped 10 feet away. "I'm here to negotiate." "You have nothing to trade," Marcus sneered, gesturing around the room like he was showing off a vacation home. "I have your city, I have your money, I have your reputation in a dumpster with a warrant taped to it." He smiled. "And soon, I'll find your little pet dancer and finish what the bullet started." "You have the city," Dominic agreed. He unzipped his jacket slowly. The blocks of C4 came into view, wired together with the kind of care that suggests someone watched a lot of YouTube tutorials. The detonator was in his hand, thumb resting on the trigger. "But you don't have tomorrow." The guards raised their weapons immediately. 20 rifles swinging toward him in a synchronization that would have been impressive if it wasn't aimed at his chest. But they hesitated. They were too close. If they shot him and he went down, the dead man's switch would trigger. The blast radius in an enclosed space like this was a math problem nobody wanted to solve. Marcus's smile faltered. Just a twitch. Just enough. "You're bluffing. You're a narcissist, Dom. You love yourself too much to die." "I used to," Dominic whispered. His thumb hovered over the button. "Goodbye, brother." Click. The lights didn't flicker. They died. The main breaker was thrown. The slaughterhouse plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The kind that makes you realize how much you've been taking electricity for granted. Dominic froze. He hadn't pressed the button. Thud. A body hit the floor somewhere to his left. Snap. The wet sound of cartilage giving up. Gurgle. Someone trying to scream through a throat that no longer worked. The darkness came alive, not the panicked stumbling of guards bumping into each other in confusion. This was surgical, efficient. The wet, tearing sound of a predator moving through a pen of sheep who had just realized they weren't armed. They were dinner. "Lights!" Marcus screamed, his voice pitching higher than it had in a decade. "Turn on the..." Crunch. A body flew out of the dark and slammed into Marcus, knocking him flat onto the concrete with a sound like a sack of money hitting pavement. The emergency red floods kicked on, bathing the room in a blood-colored haze that was doing nobody's blood pressure any favors. 10 guards were down. Their throats were open. Clean cuts. Professional work. Dominic stood alone in the center of the kill floor, C4 still strapped to his chest, detonator still in his hand. Absolutely no idea what had just happened. But he wasn't looking at the bodies. He was looking up, perched on a rusty steel beam 20 feet above him, crouched like something out of a Gothic cathedral that had gotten deeply lost on its way to Vespers, was Elena. She was gray-faced. Her bandages were soaked through with fresh blood. She was shaking, from blood loss, from shock, from the sheer physical impossibility of what she'd just done, holding 2 butcher knives she had clearly stolen from the prep room on her way in. She dropped, landed between Dominic and Marcus with barely a sound, her knees absorbing the impact in a way that should not have been possible for someone who'd been sedated on a veterinary table 2 hours ago. She stumbled slightly, caught herself, didn't look at the army of remaining guards staring at her like she'd just risen from the dead. She looked at Dominic. Her eyes were burning with a feverish, half-dead rage. The kind that comes from waking up, reading a goodbye note, stitching your own wound shut with veterinary thread, and deciding that absolutely not, we are not doing this. "I didn't give you permission to die, Dominic," she rasped, raising the knives. Her hands were shaking. She didn't lower them. "Permission denied," Marcus snarled, pulling a serrated combat knife from his belt, because apparently tonight hadn't been dramatic enough already. "Kill them both!" The slaughterhouse erupted. The remaining Vipers surged forward like a wave made of bad decisions and tactical gear, but they were fighting a 2-headed monster. Dominic was the shield, a wall of pure, desperate violence, using his fists to shatter ribs and clear space with the subtlety of a wrecking ball that had given up on permits. Elena was the needle, weaving through the gaps, her butcher knives flashing in the red emergency light like something out of a fever dream choreographed by someone with unresolved issues. But Elena was slowing down. Her wound was tearing open. Blood was soaking through the bandages Dr. Aris had applied with shaking hands, and what he had described very clearly as veterinary-grade hope. A mercenary saw his shot, raised a shotgun, aimed at her exposed back. "Elena!" Dominic roared. He didn't think, didn't calculate the risk, didn't do any of the things a crime lord is supposed to do when survival is on the line. He threw himself across the line of fire. Boom! The slug caught Dominic square in the thigh, shattering his femur with the sound of something expensive breaking permanently. He went down hard, his scream raw and guttural, blood instantly pooling on the concrete in a way that was going to require an industrial mop and several months of physical therapy. "Dominic!" Elena screamed, her focus fracturing for the first time all night. Miss Marcus saw his opening. Of course he did. He'd been waiting for it. He lunged, thrusting his combat knife straight at Elena's throat. A kill shot, fast and precise and unavoidable. The kind of move you practice 10,000 times until it's instinct. Thwack! The sound echoed through the suddenly silent room. Marcus froze. His knife had stopped an inch from Elena's jugular. Not because he'd missed, not because he'd hesitated, because Elena had caught his wrist midair. It was the exact same move she had used on Dominic in the club. The same grip, the same locked wrist, the same Spetsnaz death lock that Titan had recognized 7 chapters and a lifetime ago. Except this time, there was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation, no mercy, just the cold, dead calm of someone finishing what should have been finished the first time. "Such you have poor form, Marcus," she whispered, blood dripping from the corner of her mouth. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried. "You telegraph your thrust." Crack! She twisted. Marcus screamed, a high, broken sound that didn't belong to a man who had orchestrated the fall of an empire, as his radius snapped cleanly in two. In one fluid motion, Elena reversed his own knife and drove it into his chest, just below the sternum, angled up toward the heart. Marcus crumpled. The architect was dead, collapsed on the kill floor of his own headquarters, taken out with his own blade, in a room full of people who had been paid very well to prevent exactly this. The remaining Vipers raised their weapons, 10 men, 10 guns, all aimed at the half-dead girl swaying over Marcus's body, holding a bloody knife in a hand that was shaking from blood loss and adrenaline depletion and the sheer physical impossibility of still being conscious. Elena didn't lower the knife. She looked at them with a gaze that could freeze over hell and charge it rent. "He's dead," she rasped. "Who wants to be next?" Silence. One by one, the Vipers lowered their weapons. They were wolves, mercenaries, professionals. And professionals follow the strongest leader, not the richest one. And the strongest leader in the room, bleeding, swaying, barely upright, was the girl in the gray sweatpants who had just killed their boss with his own knife after surviving a gut shot, a car crash, and a 10-story drop in the same evening. Nobody moved. Elena took that as a yes. 6 months later, the Gilded Cage was gone, demolished, erased from the city like it had never existed, which according to the insurance company, the city council, and several very confused federal investigators, it technically hadn't. In its place stood the Onyx, a fortress of black marble and gold, the kind of establishment that doesn't advertise and doesn't need to. If you know, you know. If you don't, you can't afford it anyway. The club was packed. The music was thumping, a deep, hypnotic bass line that made expensive glassware vibrate and convince people to make decisions they'd regret in the morning. In the VIP booth overlooking the floor, Dominic Volkov sat on his throne. He looked different, older maybe, quieter. There was a silver-handled cane leaning against his chair, custom-made Italian, one and a permanent reminder of the leg he'd sacrificed on a slaughterhouse floor for a woman who had, at the time, been bleeding out from a gut shot. Worth it, he'd decided. Every time his leg ached in the cold, he decided it again. Below him, near the bar, a drunk hedge fund manager in a suit that cost more than most cars was screaming at a terrified new waitress. "I said no ice, you stupid girl," the man shouted, his voice pitched high with the specific entitlement of someone who has never been told no in a way that mattered. He raised his hand to backhand her across the face. The waitress flinched, closed her eyes, braced. Thwack. The blow never landed. The customer looked up, confused, his brain struggling to process why his hand had stopped moving. His wrist was caught in a vice grip, the kind that makes bones creak. Standing there, yes, leaning heavily on his silver-handled cane with his other hand, was Dominic. He hadn't sent a bodyguard. He hadn't signaled Titan, who was watching from across the room with a barely suppressed grin. He had come himself. Limped down from the VIP booth, cane and all, to handle this personally. "We don't do that here," Dominic said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, didn't need to be. The music had stopped. The entire club was watching. He tightened his grip until the hedge fund manager whimpered like a kicked dog, then shoved him toward the bouncers with enough force to make a point. "Get him out!" The bouncers, two men who looked like they bench-pressed motorcycles for cardio, grabbed the man and walked him toward the exit with the professional courtesy of people who do this for a living and take pride in their work. And the waitress stared at Dominic with wide eyes, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline. "Thank you, Mr. Volkov." "Don't thank me," Dominic said, looking up toward the mezzanine. He smiled, just slightly. "Thank the boss." The waitress followed his gaze. Elena stood on the balcony. The gray sweatpants were gone. So was the tank top. So was the invisible, exhausted dancer who had spilled a single drop of scotch and changed the trajectory of 2 lives in under 30 seconds. She was wearing a bespoke black Italian suit that matched Dominic's, tailored to fit a shoulder holster, cut sharp enough to make a statement. Her hair was pulled back. No jewelry except a thin silver watch. She didn't look like a weapon anymore. She looked like the person who owned the weapons. She walked down the stairs. The crowd parted without being asked. As people stepped aside instinctively, the way you do when you recognize authority that doesn't need to announce itself. She stopped in front of Dominic. He picked up his cane, smiled, a real smile this time, the kind that reached his eyes and made him look, briefly, like the man he might have been if the last 6 months had gone differently. "Ready for the next dance?" he asked. Elena reached out and adjusted his lapel with the casual intimacy of someone who has stitched your wounds, stolen your car, and saved your life in no particular order. Her fingers lingered over his heart for just a second, right where the scar from the shotgun slug sat beneath the fabric. She smiled back, not the dead-eyed calm of a sleeper agent, not the exhausted mask of someone pretending to be harmless. A real smile. "Honey, only if you let me lead." The music kicked back in. The bass dropped. The lights shifted. The club moved around them like a living thing. And somewhere in the back office, on a mahogany desk next to a very expensive bottle of scotch neither of them would ever drink, sat a framed deed to the onyx, signed by both of them.